TA for mechanics of growth when I took this class. So I always tell Adrian he was my TA. So I think of him as like, very advanced.
That's very generous. Yes, I guess I was TA for that class. And then I was working with Ellen Kuo, and you were working with Christian Linder at the time.
Yeah.
And when did you go do your postdoc at Austin?
So I finished it 2018. Yeah. So I finished at Stanford at 2018. And then I went to UT Austin to do a postdoc for a year before then moving to Boston in January 2020. So it was a little like, I don't know. It's weird because I've been in Boston now for almost 4 years, but it kind of doesn't feel that way. It feels like a weird like time dilation or something like that.
Well, because it was COVID, I guess you moved to Boston at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah. So. Yeah. When did the EML webinars start? Was it right at the beginning of the pandemic, or was it not till the next fall?
The very first one started on April the 15th.
Okay. Nice.
2020. We are probably one of the earliest webinar series at the earliest stage of COVID.
Yeah.
There were more later on.
Yeah. No.
So this came out of the an idea from Zhigang Su. And, he said, everybody is stuck at home. We have plenty of time. So he talked to Teng, and they two came up with this idea, why don't we have a Zoom webinar series? Turned out to be hugely successful.
Yeah. No, I remember like, I definitely watched many of them, and I had my students watch them too. And it was really nice to sort of get to like connect with people, I guess, or like see what other people were working on. It was, I don't know, it was very like necessary, I think.
And just to give you an example, I was at the SES meeting in Minneapolis this time, last week, and quite a few people came up to me and say, "Oh, Jimmy Xia, I know you." I said, "Really?" He said, "Oh, I saw you at the webinar." EML webinar. Yeah. So the impact is there.
Yeah. No, it's great that it's like tied to the journal and kind of I don't know. It's great for young people in the mechanics community to have more opportunities kind of to connect with people and, I don't know, share some of what we've been doing in the lonely few years, the pandemic.
Yeah, and also all the EML webinars, this one included, is archived in YouTube channel as well, and we do see more and more people visit the YouTube channel and view the past webinars. So somewhat like the long tail effect. So Emma, your presentation and the webinar today will have more views down the road. So that's another service we try to provide.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And definitely for like, I don't know, especially as like a beginning lab, trying to recruit PhD students and sort of like just reach out more broadly, having things like this is super helpful because I mean, students are more likely, or prospective students are more likely to see something like this than maybe like a paper or something like that.
Yeah. And also later on, you can send the your webinar YouTube URL to the prospective student, ask them to take a look about the webinar first, and then get to know your research better.
That's a good idea. Yeah, I'll put it on my website.
And it's going to be there forever.
Yeah, exactly.
A little intimidating.
That's okay. Just like your publications, right? Every paper you publish there is permanent, and it accumulates your impact over the years, right? similar thing for the webinar, EML webinar here.
That's true. Yeah. No, it definitely like it definitely is important, I think, to remember that when, you know, you're trying to like spend the last several hours to try to make it perfect. You're like, I need the motivation. It's going to be online forever.
But no pressure, just have fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, the format is great. With that and the discussion afterwards, I think that's what makes the EML webinar special. That it's not just a seminar, but that there's, you know, a lot of discussion after.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll talk about it a little bit in the presentation, but I also had an opportunity to write an iMechanica Journal Club post about a year ago. And that was another really good sort of like, I don't know, mechanics community opportunity. It's nice that there's like, it's like Adrian wrote one. Was it October that you wrote, Adrian, or?
September, I guess.
September.
A month ago.
September.
Yeah, I did the September entry.
Yeah.
Tissue mechanics.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice to have like a few different sort of ways of sharing what we're working on. It's nice that infrastructure exists. And I don't know, I was talking to some people recently about like the work that goes into kind of maintaining the iMechanica website behind the scenes, and it's so DIY, I guess. Ting, you're an administrator for it?
Serve as the architect, so we do the daily operation and maintenance of that. And again, any post you post over there will be permanent as well, which means that more people will read that and may respond to that as well. So that's another way you can share information and communicate with other people in the community. Yeah.
We have one of our panelists already here. So I think that's good.
Okay, Adrian, I think we have 2 minutes before 10 o'clock. Maybe we can start introducing Emma. Then we can give the floor to Emma and let her give the presentation.
Sounds good. Right. Are you ready, Emma? Ready to go?
I think
ready
so.
to go? Okay.
Hopefully.
Well, let's go ahead and get it started. Our speaker for this EML webinar is going to be Emma Lejeune. Emma Lejeune is an assistant professor in the mechanical engineering department at Boston University. She received her PhD from Stanford in 2018, where we overlapped for a couple of years. And after that, she moved to Austin. She was a Peter O'Donnell Jr. postdoctoral fellow at the Odin Institute at the University of Texas at Austin until 2020, when she joined the faculty at BU. At BU, Emma has been super successful. She has received the David R. Dalton Career Development Professorship, Computational Science and Engineering Junior Faculty Fellowship, the Haythorne-Waite Research Initiation Grant from the ASME Applied Mechanics Division, the Extreme Mechanics Layer Young Investigator Award, and the American Heart Association Career Development Award. And her current research areas involve integrating data-driven and physics-based computational models and characterizing and predicting the mechanical behavior of heterogeneous materials and biological systems. So quite the list of accomplishments, and we are very happy to have her talk about her work here in the EML webinar. So Emma, I guess it's 10 o'clock, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for the kind introduction and for agreeing to be the host. Can everybody see my slides okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So first of all, I would just like to briefly say thank you very much to Zhang for hosting the EML seminar series, and also to Jimmy and Ting for making this happen. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I really appreciate what the EML community has done for young investigators, especially. It's been just a really great opportunity to kind of connect with people, and it's a great journal to publish our work in. So I really appreciate that. So just as a very sort of bit of background kind of before I jump into the scientific components of my presentation, I started my lab in January 2020. This is a recent photo of the graduate students in my group. We have Jeffrey, Kwan, Lingzhao, Hiba, and Saeed. And we have a bunch of fantastic collaborators at Boston University and other institutions. And we work on a bunch of different areas. Machine learning for mechanics, data-driven modeling, and mechanical computing are kind of the three general areas that we work on. And they're really linked together by our passion, both for mechanics, but also for computational research. So we're largely a computational research lab. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically two main areas where we've taken our fundamental training in mechanics and applied it to other fields. So first, the area that I'm going to talk about is mechanics and machine learning. So this idea of machine learning-based metamodels. And second, I'm going to talk a little bit about mechanics and tissue engineering. And before I sort of get into like the heart of this presentation, I'm going to spend the next couple of slides trying to convince you all that these areas actually have quite a bit in common. So there's a reason why we're interested in both of them, and there's some interesting methodological overlap between the two. So just first of all, we as a group are scientifically very interested in the mechanical behavior of heterogeneous materials. Critically, this is an area where simulation is really beneficial. And there's kind of an incentive to develop technology to speed up simulations. And as you can also see on this slide, this idea of material heterogeneity is quite relevant to many different types of biological tissues, including tissue engineering constructs, which is basically what's shown right here. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. The second thing, and this is maybe the sort of more methodological take on it, is that these types of problems we're interested in within the mechanics and machine learning domain are problems that involve very large data sets. And one thing that's really exciting about our collaborators in tissue engineering is that they're really all starting to move towards high throughput experiments, which means they're actually generating massive amounts of data in a way that's really kind of unprecedented, which is really exciting. So we have this methodological scope that crosses both domains, involving going from kind of large data sets to curated data to computational models, which to us is quite interesting. But it's also an area that has a sort of a handful of associated challenges. One thing that we sort of started appreciating when we looked out in the literature in both these fields, it's really difficult to compare results across papers. It's not necessarily straightforward to reproduce the results of others. But despite these downsides, and perhaps because of these downsides, and because this workflow is really just, only recently becoming extremely popular, we really have this opportunity to try to define a new gold standard or best practices for how we do things. So what we spend a lot of time thinking about, and part of what I'm going to talk about today, is how can we come up with best practices for really kind of performing research and systematic computational research in these areas. And one thing that we've kind of landed on as a group with this opportunity to think about the way that things should be done and what best practices should be is this connection to the general idea of open science. And very, very broadly speaking, open science is the principle and practice of making research products and processes available to all, while respecting diverse cultures, maintaining security and privacy, and fostering collaborations, reproducibility, and equity. And there's so many different areas that go into this general concept of open science. You can see on this graphic that my student Hiba made, there's a bunch of different components here. And the one that we've really been focusing on is this highlighted piece right here for data and software. And what we've done is we've basically committed to publishing our data sets and codes in order to make sure our work is accessible and reproducible by others. And we really focus on this concept of reproducibility and making the products of our research accessible to others. And it's sort of the thing that's underpinning the data-centric view of our work, which is what I'm going to talk about sort of throughout this talk. So just sort of very broadly, kind of thinking about these best practices and taking a very high level view of our work, we've really come to this perspective where we essentially really lean into sort of the data component of data-driven modeling. And we're going to start by talking about how this applies to our interest in mechanics and machine learning. This is also something that we had the opportunity to write about in an iMechanica Journal Club post for May 2022, Machine Learning and Mechanics, Curating Data Sets and Defining Challenge Problems. And it's also something that we've been thinking a lot about in our work in mechanics and tissue engineering, where we sort of think about kind of these three pillars that I'm going to talk about a little later of performing research that involves creating and curating open access data sets, open source analysis software, and then building towards open source data-driven modeling as a way to really try to understand how mechanics plays a role in these relatively complicated systems. So let's kind of get started with this talk and jump into this first area here of machine learning in mechanics. So on this slide right here, I've illustrated a concept that I'm sure some people are quite familiar with, the idea of using machine learning to more effectively simulate heterogeneous materials, where metamodels or models of models are constructed by training a machine learning model on a database of simulated results. And this practice allows us to take model inputs, so in this example, material property distributions or descriptors of geometry, and then use the machine learning-based meta model to predict fixed quantities of interest at a fraction of the computational cost of running a whole finite element simulation. And this is a concept that I'm sure many people on this webinar are extremely familiar with. And I think the thing that's kind of exciting about this is that it can become a really essential tool when you want to do things that require a high number of simulation runs. For example, multi-scale modeling, material design optimization, uncertainty quantification and sensitivity analysis, real-time prediction, data integration, and much, much more. So this slide just shows a few nice recent examples from the literature. There are so many more examples that are not shown on this slide. I actually originally made this slide in 2020. You can see from the dates of the publications, and it already feels a little bit, or it feels very out of date, to be honest. There's just so much going on in this field, and it's really exciting. But one thing that is kind of been sort of preoccupying me and the students in my group and a bunch of other people as well as we start to think about this a little bit more is that despite all this really recent and exciting work, there isn't a clear picture of what types or architectures of metamodels will work best on engineering mechanics relevant data. So to solve a given problem, there are so many different types of metamodels to choose from. And within each type of metamodel, there's so many different choices for metamodels, architecture, and hyperparameters that it's not necessarily straightforward to know where to start. And this is damaging kind of to two populations of people. One is people who want to develop a new method and say, you know, my method is the best. Let me show you how good my method is, because it's hard to compare it to others. And the other population that it's difficult for is people who are sort of looking at this general concept and saying, you know, I have an application that I'm interested in. All I want to do is solve my problem. Which tool should I use? I'm actually relatively methods agnostic. So this is something that kind of is potentially limiting. And we started thinking about, you know, what can we do to make a contribution to try and solve this problem? And what we started doing back in 2020 is looking out at other fields, specifically computer vision, and computer vision specifically because it's an area where benchmark data sets have made a massive impact, both in showcasing new methods and also motivating future research directions. So two of the most popular examples are shown here. So ImageNet, a collection of labeled images, and MNIST, a collection of labeled handwritten digits. And the thing to note here is the barrier to entry for working with these data sets is super low. You can download this MNIST data set in 2 lines of code. You could download it before I move on to the next slide with just a standard Wi-Fi connection. And these data sets and the accessibility of them makes it really easy to compare different machine learning models through their benchmark performance. And so the area that my group has really been thinking about over the past couple of years is this question: can we contribute something similar for mechanics? Or maybe more generally, what collective advances are needed in order to contribute something similar for mechanics? And as a setup, I want to sort of spend a couple of slides talking about what we see as the kind of broader motivation for creating something similar for mechanics, And this is something that, you know, we really spent a lot of time thinking about, but it's also very much an open discussion, and I'm very much sharing kind of ongoing work here. And one thing that's exciting about this webinar format is that we have a handful of panelists who all have kind of experience in this area, and will want to, and I'm hoping will be willing to sort of discuss what they see as sort of potential future directions for this area. So the first thing that we've really kind of thought about as a broad motivation for developing benchmark data sets for mechanics is this idea of the intersection of kind of education and research dissemination. So I mentioned previously, one large benefit of benchmark data sets for computer vision research is that it makes it much easier to get started with learning how to apply machine learning methods. And having similar data sets for mechanics could potentially really help with that. So many problems in mechanics are regression problems, which is a little bit less popular in the literature than classification problems, which are more common in computer vision. So having some examples of regression problems for people to learn on would be helpful. And in addition to that, having benchmark data sets makes it much easier to disseminate new methods. You can sort of disseminate your method along with the tutorial and the data to allow others to implement this method. And just sort of from the computational mechanics perspective, which is where I have my training, there's several analogies to standard benchmark problems like patch tests or Cook's membrane, where running tests is an essential part of both the education process and the dissemination of new methods. So that's kind of one big picture motivation that we think a lot about. The second big picture motivation that we think about a lot is just, it's pretty straightforward, right? But there's so many different machine learning methods to choose from and adapt to new classes of data. Access to benchmark data sets in mechanics could help us better compare between different methods in a more reproducible way. So this would be particularly useful for people who have a problem which may benefit from including a machine learning component. And they just need to know kind of which method is most likely to perform best on their problem of interest without kind of wanting to do too much work, just having a tool that they can use to solve the problem. And then finally, sort of the last big picture motivation that we've been thinking a lot about, and I think this concept is particularly important for those who study approaches such as physics-informed neural networks and things like that, is this idea that mechanical data is special, right? Mechanics data sets have the potential to really motivate new method development, but there can also be a pretty high barrier to entry, both for generating mechanical data and also for being able to sort of understand and implement kind of finite element simulations and really understand what the results of those mean and understand what is or isn't high quality data. And I think the general idea here is that if thoughtfully curated data sets were available to the broader research community, it could really accelerate innovation by making these challenge problems accessible to people whose expertise is maybe more tied to machine learning than to the tools required to generate these data. And that I think is something that I'm pretty excited about. So this slide shows here the work that my students and I have done on trying to kind of address some of these kind of big picture motivations. What it shows here is basically data sets that we've curated and disseminated open access to the broader research community. And this slide shows some illustrations of the data sets that I'm going to talk about today. We started with the mechanical MNIST data set back in 2020, which is what's shown right here, and I'll talk about that. But then we've kind of added data sets that have different challenges and motivations behind them, including some with geometric instabilities, different architectures, different patterns, material nonlinearity, kind of based on what we were interested in and the machine learning methods that we wanted to explore. So just as kind of some additional context, when we got started with this back in 2020, which is a paper that we had the privilege to publish in Extreme Mechanics Letters with the mechanical MNIST data set, we really had this idea that we wanted to create a data set for regression problems in mechanics. And the idea here is that we wanted to create something that could be a drop-in replacement for one of the most popular data sets in computer vision. So right here, we're directly inspired by the original MNIST data set of handwritten digits. And kind of just as an aside, the original data set is well known. We were motivated by its popularity, but it's also a really nice size. It's small enough to download on any modern computer with a standard Wi-Fi connection, but it's large enough to meaningfully train a neural network. So what we did here was we converted the 70,000 images to 70,000 simulations of neo-Hookean material with varying modulus, where the kind of digit shown here is a high modulus material embedded in a low modulus matrix. Then we run simulations where we deform the block of material. You can see some examples right here. And the stiff digit obviously influences how the entire domain deforms. And then for each 28 by 28 input bitmap, we report full field displacements, total change in strain energy, and total reaction force at multiple steps of applied displacement. We've run all these simulations with the open source library Phoenix. Our code is freely available on GitHub. And I can also share links to these data sets later in the talk. I hope that some people might be inspired to kind of check it out and download it for themselves and see sort of what this is kind of all about. So I said this before, but the mechanical MNIST data set sort of originally started with these simple kind of digit examples. And then we've added more and more to it, extending the scope sort of based on what we're interested in here. So here we show a more complicated pattern that we included to be an extra challenge for some of the machine learning approaches. We've included different simulation fidelities because we wanted to study this idea of multi-fidelity modeling. And then we also have this example right here with phase field fracture that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today. And again, all of these data sets we've posted online under open source licenses. So you should feel free to check them out. And if they're useful to you, you can reuse them in your own research however you want, essentially. And just as sort of a little bit of additional context, these are all hosted on the OpenBU institutional repository. And we've tried our best to include additional information that makes it really easy to work with these data sets. So abstracts, descriptions, links to all the code, and again, Creative Commons attribution, share alike 4.0 license, which indicates that anyone who's interested can use these data in their research. And the other thing that we kind of got really, really excited about is this sort of idea, right? That this idea of sharing data sets and committing to disseminating and defining benchmark problems is by necessity very much a broader community endeavor. So I had an opportunity last year to write a blog post on the website iMechanica about this topic. And there are a bunch of super insightful comments that got posted in response to that are worth checking out. And then I'm also working on a very, very informal website, like super bare bones, that essentially just lists links to open access data sets created by others. So if you have something that you think I should add to this list, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And as you can see from this list, we already have kind of a diverse selection of data sets, well beyond what a single lab could necessarily be responsible for or have in scope. So yeah, it's good if people are able to use this as a community resource, and we're really hoping to kind of build this out a little bit more in the future. So what do we actually do with these data sets? That's what I'm going to talk about now. We're creating these data sets because we're interested in studying machine learning. My next chunk of slides are a few examples of what we've done with these data sets a little bit more specifically. So having access to these data sets allows us to start asking questions. And what we think about a lot is, can machine learning methods capture nonlinearities and mechanics related problems? So for example, we added examples with material nonlinearity through phase field fracture. We've created a data set that I'm not going to talk about today, but it has some geometric nonlinearity driven by complex architecture. And can methods from other fields readily be adapted to problems in mechanics? And now I'm going to focus kind of on the scenario shown in these two left columns, where what we're going to do is we're going to use machine learning methods to predict full field deformation or full field damage for problems in mechanics. So specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to take these patterns as inputs and see if we can use machine learning approaches to predict displacement fields and then damage fields from those directly. So for full field prediction, an analogy in the computer vision research worlds is semantic segmentation. And we want to know, can we successfully adapt some of these techniques to problems in mechanics? And when we first sort of posed this question, my graduate student, Saeed, began by exploring a fairly standard neural network architecture, the UNet, which is a modification of a standard CNN that doesn't force all of the data through a bottleneck. Instead, it has these skip connections that make it a popular choice for problems in semantic segmentation. And essentially, what we found is that sort of just off the shelf, these architectures were not particularly effective at capturing these data. We're consistently unable to make predictions that we were satisfied with. So this right here shows what the predictions kind of looked like, or what the sort of like state of the art was before we started looking into this a little bit more. And on this slide, what I want everyone to kind of remember is you can see a histogram with frequency percentage versus absolute percent error on the x-axis. And you can see these methods are consistently giving us around 5% error on the fashion MNIST data set. And the worst case scenario predictions are not particularly good, which is something that we might really care about if we're looking at maybe safety critical applications or something like that. So if you compare essentially these red markers here to these gray markers here, you can see that the predictions are not necessarily doing a very good job at predicting the actual outcomes. And we felt motivated to see if we could essentially do better than this. So what we landed on was essentially this. So Saeed, my PhD student, designed a meta model architecture that we refer to as the multi-res WNet. It's the model architecture that's illustrated on this slide. It's essentially two multi-resolution UNet blocks in series to form a W shape combined with depth-wise separable convolutions. The multi-res architecture is a modification of the standard UNet architecture that replaces the sequence of regular convolutions by these multi-resolutional convolutional blocks, and passes the encoder output at each level through a convolutional residual path before concatenating with this upsampled tensor right here. And these changes, in a very kind of hand-wavy way, we think, make it easier for the meta model to extract features at different levels of zoom, which is important for mechanics problems where both global, local, and intermediate scale features influence the problem solution. We also found that replacing regular convolutions with depthwise separable convolutions improved the model performance, and that concatenating two units in series also significantly improved the performance. We've posted all of the code for this on GitHub for anyone who's more interested in the details here. And we're also really interested if people have sort of figured out architectures that do better on these data. And that's something that, you know, is a conversation we'd really like to have, and is directly enabled by us publishing our code and the data alongside it to allow others to compare their methods to what we have right here. So what you can see on this slide is a direct comparison between the UNet, which we were initially kind of dissatisfied with, and our multi-res WNet. And we note that our approach does better not only on average, so notice the x-axes of these histograms right here, but also on these worst case examples, you can see these illustrations right here. So if you go back to the UNet, we think about 4.51% error, whereas for our multi-res WNet, we're seeing about 1% error. And again, if you compare the gray markers to the red markers right here, you can see that the multi-res WNet is really quite effective. There's almost perfect overlap, even in these kind of worst case scenario predictions. And this slide right here shows some additional visualizations of the multi-res WNet performance. So again, full field predictions of displacement in a hyperelastic material, which is what Saeed kind of relied on when determining this architecture. So essentially this heterogeneous block of material undergoing applied displacement. And we applied the meta model to 4 different data sets within the mechanical MNIST collection. And if you look at the histograms on these slides, you can see that for all 4 examples that we looked at, uniaxial extension and equibiaxial extension for mechanical MNIST and mechanical MNIST fashion, the absolute percentage error drops below 1%. And our predictions are really quite close to perfect, and sort of to see the difference between sort of how these predictions compare to the ground truth, you have to really look at these worst case scenario predictions. And from this, you can see that our meta model performs quite well on this hyperelastic material data set. And we kind of felt like our meta model worked so well that we decided we needed to create something that was more challenging and potentially more interesting to properly evaluate it, and then also sort of motivate future work in developing even better machine learning methods for these problems. So what we did was we created the mechanical MNIST crack path dataset, where we converted the fashion MNIST bitmaps into a material with heterogeneous inclusions, and then ran a linear elastic phase field model simulation where each bitmap leads to a unique crack path. And you can see here, this problem is set up with kind of strange loading conditions. That's because it gave us a good balance between diversity in the data set. So different crack paths for each kind of prediction, they don't all look alike. But then also this implementation feasibility, which meant that we could sort of run tens of thousands of simulations and not necessarily have to worry about half of them crashing and things that would be completely intractable. And just like our mechanical MNIST data sets, this one's freely available for download and includes these full field damage fields along with force versus displacement curves for each input geometry. And if this is interesting to you, please feel free to check it out and download it and use it for your own purposes. So just as a brief kind of aside, the compute error on these data, we use the F1 score, which ignores the true negative pixels. The formula for the F1 score is shown on these slides. And as you can see in these images, we really want to focus on the crack itself. So we want to quantify error rather than being able to kind of focus on whether or not it's able to correctly predict background pixels, because if we used a different error metric, it would look like the model was performing almost perfectly all the time, even if it wasn't actually doing so well. And this slide shows how the meta model performs. We're able to achieve an average F1 score of 0.87 on the test data. And for context, we also wanted to compute how many examples predicted kind of continuous crack paths, where errors often look more like these plausible alternative paths that a crack could take, where there's kind of an initial sort of wrong decision about avoiding inclusion, and then also incorrect predictions which have both low F1 score and discontinuous paths. And on this data set, we considered 79% of our predictions correct by these kind of combined quantitative and qualitative metrics, where you really have to zoom in to see differences between the meta model prediction and ground truth, like what you can see right here. But there's also definitely room for improvement. And this is something that is kind of motivating us to try to develop better methods to be able to make these types of predictions. And really kind of, I'm talking through a few aspects of the study, not the whole thing. But I think the kind of important takeaway is that we're sort of trying to define some kind of best practices or methodological approaches for how to look at these problems kind of along the way as we study these specific examples. And sort of the key points that we really think are worth emphasizing here is how important the process is of defining performance evaluation metrics, defining data sets for evaluation, defining machine learning approaches to study, and then also evaluating results to provide context for what is good performance. And we discuss this more in our extreme mechanics letters paper right here. And critically, we learned from the study, sort of a standard for ourselves and how we want to perform future computational experiments at scale. And in particular, we've recently gotten really interested, in this idea of uncertainty quantification and trying to better understand model calibration. So this slide right here shows some preliminary work in looking at ensembles of crack path predictions. And one thing that we found that is really interesting is that if we initialize a neural network training for training with different initial random seeds, we can sometimes get subtly different patterns in crack path predictions. And we found that we can potentially leverage this to make better ensemble predictions. And this is just one area. This is kind of a slide that I thought was cool that we've been looking at as a direction for future work. And along the way with this, I don't want to go into too much detail because I know I have limited time. But I just want to point out another quick snapshot of a project that we've been working on kind of applying this paradigm to other areas where we really want to set up kind of large computational experiments on multiple open access data sets. So we've gotten really interested recently in looking at classification problems in mechanics. And in particular, you can frame the previous example as a classification problem as well, where pixels are predicted as damaged or undamaged. And in engineering applications, decisions are often very safety critical. And there's really a desire sort of for meaningful information on model confidence. So just for reference, if a model predicts there's a 75% chance that a group of inputs will be in class 1, it's considered kind of well calibrated if that prediction is correct 75% of the time. And we got really interested in trying to understand not just sort of whether or not the deep learning model predictions were accurate, but whether or not deep learning model were able to produce kind of well calibrated results. And I'm going to go kind of quickly through this. This is just sort of a snapshot of what we're thinking about. But what we're able to do now that we have access to a bunch of large open access mechanics data sets is that we can think about a problem that we want to study. We can select several different relevant data sets. So in this case, we chose 3 examples we chose the BIC data set, where classification problems can be framed as predicting whether or not a column with heterogeneous material is going to be stable or unstable under some given load. The ABC data set, where you have heterogeneously architected columns that are going to buckle left or right. And then the mechanical MNIST crackpot data set, where each pixel is either damaged or undamaged. And then kind of with these data sets, we can study model error and model calibration error simultaneously. And these plots show these results with error on the y-axis and calibration error on the x-axis. And essentially, the point on this slide, there's kind of a lot going on. But by looking at multiple data sets and being able to really sort of look at a bunch of different types of problems all at once, we can start to see sort of trends emerge. And from performing kind of these larger scale studies like this, we can start to see that ensemble neural networks are a potentially promising approach. And this is sort of getting into the weeds a little bit, but we can see that ensemble averaging combined with temperature scaling, which is a post-hoc calibration method, is potentially a consistent approach to improving model calibration. And really, the goal here is to start moving towards these larger computational experiments, and moving towards these larger computational experiments where the data needed for others to reproduce and build on this work is made available along the way. So that's kind of a snapshot of sort of some of our future directions in this mechanics and machine learning work. And with this sort of idea in mind, I'm going to use sort of the remainder of my time to discuss the second area that my group has been working on, which falls within tissue engineering. And again, I'm going to just give a few snapshots of the types of problems we've been focused on. Again, within this broader scope of mechanical behavior of heterogeneous materials, and this kind of methodological paradigm of large data sets, curated data sets, and then moving towards computational models. So just sort of very, very big picture, mathematical modeling of biological systems has allowed us to really understand how mechanics plays a role and leads to emergent behavior in all sorts of diverse systems, biofilms, plants, forming seashells, neuronal growth during development, and computational modeling and simulation. We've also been really able to see how mechanics plays a role in things like patient-specific medicine. For example, on this slide, we have examples relevant to brain surgery, valve surgery, heart disease, and tumor growth. And just sort of in general, there's kind of this paradigm for developing mathematical and computational models to understand the mechanical behavior of biological systems. And this is something that, I spent a lot of time in graduate school really thinking about, where sort of, you observe some experimental or clinical results in the natural worlds, and then you develop an analytical expression or simulation approach to understand our observations better and make predictions. And this has led to a lot of really, really interesting work in understanding the role of mechanics and how mechanics influences the natural world. But more recently, we've gotten really interested in this idea of data-driven modeling of some of these systems. And in this world, things are just kind of amorphous and all over the place. Here's an example of all sorts of data types that might be available or relevant to just one problem that we're interested in, this area of cardiac tissue engineering. And with this very, very broad scope, even if we reduce it to the things that we kind of actually focus on, here are sort of the types of examples of data that my group often works with. On the slide, it shows a bunch of different types of image-based data. And we sort of need to think, how do we want to organize these data so they can be formulated into a model where we have kind of some inputs, some machine learning models, some outputs, and how can we kind of, use this as an opportunity to understand how mechanics, this incredibly rich domain with a lot of kind of fundamentals and fundamental understanding, plays kind of a role in defining the behavior of these really, really complicated systems. There's been a ton of recent work in this area of data-driven modeling of biological systems. Over the past 5 years or so, data-driven approaches have been used for constitutive modeling, systems identification, surgical planning, and diagnosis. But because this area is kind of so new, there isn't really a typical way to go about approaching these problems. So kind of similar to the previous problem that we were thinking about of applying machine learning to mechanics, we've really kind of had this opportunity to try to take a step back and think about how we want to do things systematically. And that's what's led us to this kind of general paradigm that we've been trying to set up across a couple of different projects that we're involved in. And this is very much a work in progress, and it's something that I would love to discuss more during the panel. But the idea here is that for each sort of system or scientific challenge that we explore, we're really interested in working with our experimental collaborators to think through kind of the 3 pillars that are illustrated on this slide. So we think a lot about open access data sets, open source analysis software for extracting meaning from these data sets. So from going from those images that I showed on the previous slide to numbers and important quantities of interest. And then ultimately open source data-driven modeling that is directly enabled by having access to these data and the software required to extract meaning from it. So right now we're working on 2 projects in this area. One is a collaboration in cardiac tissue engineering, and the other one is a collaboration in vitro modeling of wound healing. And with the remainder of my time, I'm just going to give brief snapshots of what we're doing here. So for the first project in cardiac tissue engineering, we have experimental collaborators through the NSF CellMet Engineering Research Center. And what our experimental colleagues are working on is technology where they can take cells from patients in a very minimally invasive manner. So from the blood or the skin, reprogram those cells into pluripotent stem cells, and then differentiate those cells into cardiomyocytes, which can then be used to create patient-specific engineered heart tissue, and also potentially understand patient-specific drug response in vitro. And what we do, which is essentially a very, very small part of this very big picture, is work with our collaborators to extract more information from images and movies of these cells and from tissues that come from these cells. And these cells have a fairly nonlinear structure. So you can see these are a little bit hard to see, but I'll have some more examples on future slides. But basically they have this kind of nonlinear complicated structure that can be difficult to interpret. And then they also have recordings of these cells beating and deforming mechanically. And what we essentially want to do is we want to be able to go from these images and movies to mechanically relevant quantities of interest that can be used to better understand these systems. So the 2 types of data that we've been working with here are these cellular scale data sets where you have images of cells with fluorescently labeled striations. So this right here shows a sarcomere, which is the fundamental contractile unit of the heart. So they fluorescently labeled Ds, and a sarcomere is essentially the component that connects these 2 fluorescently labeled Z disks. And then we've also been looking at a bunch of data sets that go up a spatial scale and look at these kind of beating microtissue, which are self-assembled collections of these cells and extracellular matrix suspended between posts. So we've been working with our collaborators to essentially publish some large open access data sets of these tissue. And that's a work in progress, although we do have one very preliminary one that's out right now. But then what we've really been working on is developing these software tools to extract information from these data. So we've been creating software and methods to analyze movies of beating-induced pluripotent stem cell-derived cardiomyocytes with these fluorescently labeled striations. And what that kind of comes down to is methods and code to segment, track, and analyze the sarcomeres in these movies. We've done this very much in collaboration with our partners through CellMet. And as you can see kind of from these slides, this is a movie of a beating cell. And if you really kind of appreciate how much is going on here, these movies are incredibly data rich. Each dot in this movie is an individual sarcomere contractile unit. And part of what we've been working on is how to distill mechanical information into a format that's useful and allows us to better understand both the behavior of individual sarcomeres, but then also the emergent contractile function of these cells. So for example, in this graphic, we not only look at the average sarcomere length changes, but we also can do things like treating each sarcomere as a fiducial marker and look at the overall emergent kinematic behavior of the entire cell. So you can see here this kind of superimposed pink circle that plots the average deformation based on the motion of the kind of collective of sarcomeres within the cell. And you can see that even though kind of individual sarcomeres might not be perfectly in sync, it still does lead to this overall emergent contractile behavior. Another thing that we've been thinking about a lot is how can we format data from these images and movies so that they're kind of broadly useful and can be compared across different examples. Just very briefly, we titled our code SarcGraph because we developed a method to kind of treat these cells as graph structures. And representing the data this way has a lot of potential benefits. that we've kind of just barely begun exploring. But we're really interested in using this kind of as a framework to explore spatial correlations throughout these cells and do things like understand, local versus global sarcomere alignment, but also whether or not correlations with regard to mechanical contractile function are stronger with respect to things like network distance, so the distance along the graph, or Euclidean distance, and try to kind of understand all of that a little bit better. Moving up a spatial scale, we've also been working on software to extract mechanical information from these kind of cardiac microbundles, which is what's illustrated right here. And without getting into too much detail, we've worked on the software to segment, track, and analyze the overall mechanical deformation of these microtissue. This slide basically shows the steps in the framework. We've also done a lot of work, and once we've created these software pipelines, we've done a lot of work in validating them, both with synthetic data and with respect to kind of manual tracking, like what's shown right here on this slide. Our collaborators were very kind to perform manual tracking on our behalf. And you can see both on these examples, our software performs quite well. And the thing that sort of is interesting to us is that it really allows us to get more information from these data and more information kind of specifically about the way these things are deforming mechanically. So right here, you can see a displacement field, and here you can see strain sort of collected across these bins here. It's not necessarily reliable enough to get strain at each point just due to the limitations of the imaging modality. But what we're kind of pushing for and getting excited about is this opportunity to just get more mechanical information from these data. So right here, you can compare what's accessed through pillar tracking. So tracking basically just these pillars right here. You get sort of a single curve that shows the force or an approximation of the force in the pillars. And what you can sort of start to appreciate is that if you have sort of the tools to analyze it, you can start to pull out kind of more complex patterns in these tissue. You can start to see heterogeneity, synchrony, lack of synchrony in these data. And this is very much an ongoing project. Right now, we're really interested in trying to build models that combine data across scales and builds computational models that rely on these created data sets. But so far, we focused on publishing our software, and you can sort of check out this work also by some of our collaborators who've built a really interesting model of a certain type of these tissue. And this is, again, something that happy to follow up with in the discussion or offline if anyone is interested. And just very briefly, we've also worked with another experimental collaborator here at BU on the second project, in vitro modeling of wound healing. And what our collaborator has done, which is really fascinating to us, is that he's developed a 3D model of fibrous tissue assembly and repair, where essentially 3D tissues self-assemble around posts, kind of similar to the last structure that you saw with cardiac tissue, but these the cell types are different and their emergent mechanical behavior is completely different. And then what our collaborator is able to do is wound these tissue with a knife or a laser and track basically the deformation of this tissue over time as the wound heals. And so this video will be taken over several hours, whereas the videos you saw previously were taken over several seconds. And what we've been working on, first of all, is working on software to pull out standard information from these data. So things like tracking the area of the wound as it closes, which saves our collaborators a bunch of time. They're previously doing this stuff manually, and allows them to perform high throughput data analysis, which is something they're excited about because they're trying to move towards a 96 well plate format for their experiments. But what we're really, really interested in that's very much ongoing is trying to develop computational tools to really go further and pull out mechanical information from these data and combine it with computational models that wasn't necessarily possible previously without a kind of software approach to getting more information from these data sets. And really similar to our last project, this is very much a work in progress. We're really excited to have collaborators who are interested in mechanical modeling, and we're working to develop better and more comprehensive techniques to curate these data. And just sort of as I kind of wrap up here, I want to take one more chance to advertise this website of open access mechanics datasets that I've been working on right here. If you have examples that you think we should add, please do get in touch. But also, please feel free to use these datasets for your own purpose. It's meant to be sort of a community resource that others can benefit from. And in the spirit of kind of this EML webinar with a panel discussion, I also wanted to share kind of this timeline of the work that my group has been doing. We actually first published on this idea of open access mechanics datasets as a resource for the community as an EML paper back in 2020. And we've been kind of working on this idea kind of continuously. You can see here there's a lot of rejected proposals along the way. But we've recently managed to get a small amount of funding to kind of really like invest more resources in building out this as something that's useful to the community. So I would very much like to hear from people both in the second part of this discussion, but then also more generally on what would potentially be the most useful, because now we have the resources to really try and achieve that. Finally, I'd really like to thank my students and collaborators and funding sources for making all this work possible. And I'd like to thank the organizers again for making this webinar happen. I really appreciate this opportunity. And just to anyone who's listening, please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have additional questions or things to discuss.
Thank you so much, Emma. Okay, yeah. Virtual clap for the seminar. All right. Well, thanks so much, Emma, for that awesome seminar. And then, yes, I see that you're posting some of the links also on the chat. And then I think we can move to the panel discussion, and I'll try to monitor also the participants in case anyone has a question. So we have a good panel here. So maybe the panelists can turn on their cameras. We have Manuel Rausch, Nick Blases, Junior Chu, Samdata Goswani, and Francisco Savi as the panelists for this session. So yeah, maybe we can go ahead if any one of you has a question for Emma. You can go ahead and ask.
Can I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the great talk. And actually, I don't think I ever got the chance to thank you directly. Like a few months ago, I actually used one of your data sets and we published a paper on it. We used the mechanical MNIST data set. And I never got to thank you because this happens a lot. I've worked on a lot of machine learning, modeling, and in mechanics, you usually have to go for synthetic data up to now. And it's always like the panic sets in when you have to both juggle like generating the data and actually doing the actual modeling, right? So the fact that there was a straightforward data set to actually start using, I truly appreciate it. Yeah, so my question is, have you, another common thing in machine learning datasets and computer vision datasets is the question about data augmentation and the question of synthetic data, but it's not as straightforward when we're talking about that in mechanics problems, right? You cannot just rotate an image of a microstructure and then you have to think what actually happens in the mechanical behavior. Is this something that you have discussed in your work, how actually data augmentation looks like in a mechanics framework?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's definitely something that we've thought about a lot, but have only looked at it in a very, very limited scope. So we had one project that I didn't talk about here, where this was the motivation for our mechanical MNIST Cahn-Hilliard data set, where we basically looked at using a generative adversarial network to try and create synthetic patterns, and then use those synthetic patterns to augment the sort of real patterns that we had. And what we found was that you basically just kind of barely get anything for free, if that makes sense. Yeah, so what we were able to do is we were able to successfully use the GAN to kind of create some augmented patterns to improve our data set or to improve sort of the results of our machine learning model. But then, I was sitting with my students and we were kind of talking about it, and we were like, it's improving it, but by how much is it improving it? Like, is it meaningful? Does it make a difference? And what we ended up doing was we ended up coming up with some kind of like procedurally generated patterns that were just really, really simple. And those weren't quite as good, but they weren't that much worse than the kind of complicated GAN that we'd implemented. So sort of to make a long story short, we've thought about it a little bit, but we haven't sort of come up with anything that we feel is necessarily sort of super impactful in the area of data augmentation specifically. One thing that we have sort of looked at that we did think was a little bit more kind of impactful, and I know a couple other people on the call have spent a lot of time thinking about this, is augmenting data sets with low fidelity examples. So this kind of multi-fidelity modeling approach. And we found that can be extremely powerful, just really, really simple kind of transfer learning approaches, but then also maybe more involved multi-fidelity modeling approaches can be really useful. But that sort of is not exactly data augmentation, right? That's like kind of something else maybe, but yeah.
Yeah. So actually, I have played around with your data set, used generative AI to create synthetic data. And what I understood, I didn't expect it to happen, is that these generative AI models actually learn the distribution of data very well. So when you generate data, you're probably going to generate data in the data ranges, the data distributions that you had before. So I think it's kind of expected what you actually verified, that it won't really like increase your model like capacity if you just use data from the same data distribution, right? Yeah. But it has, I think it has some good like I think it gives you a good understanding of the data distributions, and maybe there are other problems there, like design and selecting microstructures from your data sets. But yeah, that's another discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I'm also really excited. I saw your talk at USNCCM, and I was super excited that you'd used our data set. So yeah, we definitely like other people using the work that we've put out.
Yeah, thank you again.
Is there any other question from the panel? Maybe a follow-up regarding generative models or data augmentation. That maybe someone else wants to jump in. Some data. I see that you are unmuted.
Yeah. Hi, Emma. Firstly, amazing talk as always. So I really enjoyed it, and I am also using a couple of your data sets.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah, so I wanted to understand a little bit about the fracture data set that you have. So, so the loading that you're applying, is it like a quasi-static, or is it like you're applying dynamic loading?
It's a quasi-static loading, and it's the same boundary conditions for all of the different material property configurations. Yeah, so quasi-static loading, same boundary conditions. But we are, I don't know when it's going to be ready, but one thing that we're working on right now is expanding that out a little bit. Still quasi-static simulations, but more diverse material property distributions. And then also different loading conditions. I know you have a data set that you published with some fracture mechanics results.
Yeah, that was like my PhD code, which I work on. Probably I tried sharing it with you so that you could even like make it public. So my question was like, when you're trying to understand fracture, most of the time it happens that you change the initial crack location or the length by a very minuscule amount. So how many of them are you considering in this data set?
Yeah.
Like, is it always like tensile loading or like shear tensile, or like, are you trying to have a mix match of the loading conditions with fracture with initial locations?
For the future data set, or the one that's already published?
The one that's already published.
Yeah, so the one that's already published, they all always have the same boundary conditions, and
even the loading conditions also.
Yeah, the same loading conditions are the same. The variation is in the heterogeneous material properties. But to your point on sort of how sensitive this is, I think this is an area where there might be a real opportunity to develop machine learning method. And I know you've done work on this as well, but to develop machine learning methods that are sort of very specifically motivated by things that are interesting about mechanics, if that makes sense. And I think that's some of what we're hoping to explore with ensemble methods in the future. Because if you, like if you train, it's super interesting. If you train a neural network with different initializations, for some examples, it's almost as if it sort of learns how sensitive these are. So it might predict, each neural network might predict a different crack path for the same sample. And then if you kind of combine them all together, you might get some sense of exactly what you're talking about, where a really subtle difference in a crack, in an inclusion location, or the way the boundary condition is applied could propagate to a very dramatic difference in the way a crack propagates. But right now, it's something that we've only sort of looked at and been like, oh, that's really interesting. We haven't made progress on it.
I was trying to explore a couple of these, and what I saw is if we are trying to somehow build a surrogate model for fracture, unless and until we include physics, we require a huge amount of data set to train the neural network. But physics normally gets it down if we have some physical equations to put through in the loss function. But yeah, I would definitely download this fracture data set and have a look over it.
Yeah, well, yeah, we should definitely stay in touch because we're working on a future data set also for the fracture problem that should be more comprehensive.
Yeah, and I'll also try to share my data set that I have.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I would love to add it to the website. Yeah, if you email me, I'll add it like right away.
I have a follow-up question, and maybe for you, and then maybe I'll also ask Francisco to chime in, because and also maybe some data as well, because of this issue with physics, and sort of I think there's popular methods in machine learning to do not just meta models, but meta models that have some physics. And how do you see that play a role in creating data sets and benchmark data sets that for physics informed machine learning, like neural operators and this type of approaches? And I know a couple of our panelists are working on that front. So maybe if you can kickstart the discussion. Yeah, Francisco.
I also have some kind of similar questions. So for example, in that fracture example that you showed, when you represent the fracture with pixels, you cannot guarantee the continuity, right? And you showed that some of the examples don't satisfy that, right? So I was wondering if you could, like, not even like imposing like the elasticity equations, but even use representations that guarantee that you will get a continuous path or things like that, like even in a more basic way than fully putting your PDs in the model.
Yeah, as kind of like an intermediate kind of between a fully physics informed approach and a fully sort of data driven physics agnostic approach.
Yes.
Yeah, I think something like that would be really interesting to explore. I think that like one thing that maybe kind of ties into I'm sure this is something that everyone thinks about a lot. This kind of idea that, you know, you can start adding like some notions of physics to your loss function or as additional constraints. But it can be really difficult to know how much they're helping you in kind of like a quantitative sort of like benchmarky way. And I think that the model that we talked about in the presentation, I view it as kind of like a sort of physics agnostic baseline. And I would definitely be really excited to see like if you add in, you know, this approach to putting physics within the model, how much can it exceed kind of that baseline performance? Exactly to your point, Francisco, because I think my intuition is that it would help, but I would want to see an example, right?
Yeah, no, and also, I mean, the approaches that you showed are very generic, right? I mean, they apply to many problems. But I also had a question about that because sometimes we deal with different geometries, and So, and where convolutional neural networks might not work very well. So I don't know if you have any thoughts of I don't know, graph neural networks or things where the geometry doesn't look or doesn't resemble an image.
Yeah, that's definitely like, I think, an area where things are kind of moving. So just as like a sort of brief aside, I think I had this on my timeline slide. But one thing that happened kind of recently that I thought was really interesting was there was a USACM workshop on developing benchmarks, and some data was there. And I'll put the link in the chat. But one thing that kind of came up was that within the world of physics-informed networks, there's this software called PDE Bench that is sort of a way to kind of benchmark different approaches. And we were discussing that in our breakout session. And the first thing that came up, to your point, Francisco, was essentially like, well, all of these are on like a square domain, especially for, and they also don't really have much solid mechanics in there. But especially for problems in kind of solid mechanics, we do really care about these more complicated domains. And so I think that is sort of like exactly the type of thing that is needed in the area. One of our data sets that we're also working on, kind of like a future version of, is our ABC data set, which has these architected columns. And we looked at graph neural networks as an approach there. And we found that point nets, which are basically a graph neural network architecture that's kind of initially designed for point clouds, works okay on these types of data. But definitely one of the things we really want to do next is kind of create a data set that has more complicated architecture and really allows us to do a better job asking questions like the one that you just mentioned, Francisco.
Yeah, I think some data you unmuted yourself, so I don't know if you want to add something to the discussion. Yeah.
So I just wanted to add with add about the fracture talk that Emma just mentioned. So basically, we did try on training neural operators for physics and data, like physics plus data. So what we saw is like, if we are training it with only physics, probably close to around 200 samples would be required for a simple shear test problem. Whereas if we add physics, around 11 samples would be sufficient, 10 or 11 samples would be sufficient to train the operator and also generalize the solution. So kind of just reiterating what she said is that it does help, but this is just one problem that I have tried. There are way more complicated fracture problems on complex domains, which might require more samples, or I don't know how much effective that would be.
Thanks for sharing the link. I remember you talked about that paper at the workshop. So yeah, thank you.
Manu, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Emma. I really appreciate it. I've had the chance to watch you do this for a couple of years now, and it's really beautiful to see it come together. And I remember you told me about your vision of putting this together and not being a machine learning or data-driven person. I was like, oh, who would use this? And now it's really beautiful to see that there's a lot of people that can really learn from this and take advantage of it. So it's really nice to be proven wrong by your friend. But aside from that, I do have a question. And so you have really converted me into an open science person. And you probably know, you've tracked me along this journey, in that we publish a lot of our data and we try to make all of our code available. And it's a pain in the ass, right? I think anybody who's done this knows that it takes a lot of work to curate the data in a way that is usable to others. It takes a lot of extra effort to make sure your code is common and all these things, right? It's a lot of work. And then you publish it and people, in the ideal case, use it and it's great, but often they get back to you, they can't compile the code, or they don't understand how to use it, etc. So my question for you is, how do you help the community sort of see the light? How do you have this conversation with others? Because I've collaborated with people that just don't want to make their code available, right? And then I get frustrated because I really believe in it. What is your spiel? You converted me. How do you convert others? Like, what is the strategy here? Give us some sales points that we can use.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of there's maybe two approaches that I think about a lot. So just for anyone who doesn't know, Manuel does really nice work in soft tissue biomechanics, and he has a Dataverse. Is that what it's called, Manuel? Where you share all of your labs data. Could you put the link to it in the chat? Like, why not, right? Yeah, and basically Manuel and I were working on a paper together, and it was really, a study that Manuel had done and put a ton of effort into, and I was, a middle author on the paper, like, just giving unsolicited advice that Manuel was very graciously tolerating. And basically we started having this conversation that was kind of like, okay, we want to publish this data. What does that even mean, first of all? And how do we do it? And what does that even mean? We sort of decided that what we wanted to do was we wanted to put the data out there in a format where others could sincerely use it. So include the metadata that was relevant to making the data useful. And in the case of mechanics, that actually can become kind of like a thorny issue, right? So, Manuel had performed these experiments on these little cubes of heart tissue, and sort of the data itself was, just more or less like an Excel spreadsheet of a bunch of numbers. But obviously you needed a ton of context to understand what those numbers actually meant, and how other people could really build on them and use them in a different study. So the metadata there, correct me if I'm wrong, Manuel, but it was like a multi-page PDF with like schematics and things like that, sort of showing how the experimental boundary conditions were set up, and kind of really explaining what every text file looked like. So I think that sort of the first way to kind of convince people to do it is to work with them on figuring out kind of the logistics for all of that. So figuring out kind of whether or not they're a part of an institution that has an institutional repository where you can post data for free. And then also to sort of have a conversation that says, like, if someone were to look at this, would they be able to make sense of it? And I think that that's kind of the initial kind of component that we think about a lot. I think the second sort of like more big picture answer is it's sort of, it's happening slowly, but I think it is actually really happening. Funding agencies are starting to start caring about open science and to really think about it a lot. 2023 was the year of open science across several different funding agencies, which I thought was very exciting. For in the US, the National Science Foundation, within the merit review criteria is this idea of broader impacts, and sharing your data and code, and sort of creating these non-publication research products can really count as a broader impact. And I think that's something that is perhaps quite motivating to people. And I think another thing that has been kind of motivating to me as well too is if you're working with certain funding agencies and you have an open science commitment in it from the beginning, it means they'll definitely be able to publish your results, which is also really nice. But yeah, I don't know. With regard to the tissue engineering project that I'm involved in as well, there's kind of been this thing that's starting to happen, where every year we meet with kind of external reviewers who kind of look at what this huge consortium of researchers is working on. And they've also started asking questions about data sharing and sort of making open science tools or results that are very broadly available to the community. And yeah, I think like, I don't know, it's sort of helping people with logistics, reminding them that funding agencies are starting to really care, and then just being like relentlessly optimistic so you annoy everyone around you. I think that's the secret, or that's what I'm working on. I don't know. So that's inaccurate, Manuel?
The annoying part definitely sounds right.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. First, Jingda, and then Nick. So Jingda, if you can unmute yourself yet, go ahead.
Thank you, Emma, for the great talk. So I have a question about the part of wound healing. So for the wound healing part, so what I understand is that you took the image and you calculate the strength from the image. So my question is, how do you cope with the stress? So
yeah.
From image, yeah.
That's a really good question. So that's something that we're working on right now. So our experimental collaborators have a lot of experience with this kind of micro post fabrication, where they basically have the tissues suspended in 3D attached to these micro posts. And the posts are made out of PDMS, and their mechanical properties can be reasonably well assumed or calibrated based on geometry and the material properties of PDMS, or also just testing with indentation. So from the deflection of those posts, which is something that we can track in these images, we're able to reasonably back out the forces at the posts. And then we can use a combination of those forces, the observed kind of strains in the tissue, and then some sort of computational model to essentially infer what the stresses are. But that's something that we haven't gotten to yet. I will say, I didn't talk about that part of our work as much, but really, like, my sort of perspective on the computational modeling side is that the computational models are not going to be sort of strictly correct, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think that for these really complicated biological systems, there's sort of one computational model that can kind of dictate everything. And what I would hope to do is to publish the data sets and software to analyze these data so that other people could also work on computational models of these systems that would maybe be better than what we end up coming up with.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
All right, Nick, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on this question about encouraging other people to chime in with their own data sets and curating big data sets like that. For example, I think I almost tried to do your to use your crack path data set, but I realized it was I think it was one of those. It had full field data. I was like, okay, that's too much to download on my computer. I'm not doing it right now. So I have a two-part question. So first of all, how do you decide when you're creating and curating data sets, what kind of data you're going to upload in sense of like strain stress paths, what kind of fields, like strain stress fields, damage fields, for example. And when we're talking about path dependent problems, for example, the data sets may end up being very, very big, right? So how do you decide what to upload? And a very practical thing, because I was looking into uploading a big data set that I have, where do you upload it and where do you host it, and how do people can get involved in something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. I think that the first thing that you mentioned, that's sort of where like our relationship with kind of general sort of peer review comes into play. So almost all of the data sets that we publish are published alongside a manuscript. And so as a bare minimum, we publish the data required to reproduce all of the results in our manuscript. And then we add on top of that things that we sort of intuitively think through might be interesting to people. So for example, with our phase field data set, we publish the force displacement curves, even though we've never used them, because they just look interesting. And we imagine those could be quite useful to some people. But one thing that's also happened a few times, including with some of our papers in EML, is that reviewers have sort of looked at what we did and said, oh, it would actually be better if you included the deformation gradient as well as the displacement, or this as well as that. And then we've gone back and been like, okay, well, we have these data on our servers. It's relatively painless to create that and upload that. And so we've added that. We've sort of grown these data sets along the way in response to suggestions from others. We've also had a couple examples of people emailing us, asking us things that were unfortunately infeasible. And we had to respond by basically saying, like, you know, the code is published on GitHub. In theory, you can rerun all of these simulations if you have access to a supercomputer and change it so that the outputs are this sort of more detailed thing that we really didn't look at. But yeah, definitely an ongoing conversation. With regard to the completely practical thing, it depends on the institution. So at Boston University, where I am, we have an institutional repository called OpenBU that I really like. However, it doesn't let you upload very large files. So we have to pay to upload through Dryad if we want to do really large files. And the fee scheme it's one of those things where it seems like a lot of money, but then you're like, oh, I guess they're going to store this data forever in perpetuity. And so Yeah, but we use Dryad. A lot of the time, if you look up like, so I found out about the Dataverse system that Manuel uses by just searching UT Austin Institutional Repository. But the other thing that I've also really learned being at BU is that the libraries and the librarians are really changing what their careers are as everything is much more digital. BU has a bunch of data librarians and people who spend kind of all of their time thinking about this stuff. And I've had a few opportunities to talk to them, and it's been extremely informative. And we've even had them as sort of like letters of support or advisors on some of our grants, and that's been really helpful.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought of that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, libraries. The
Right.
people in the libraries are extremely knowledgeable about this, and they have probably much more eloquent answers to a lot of these questions than I would. We should have invited some of them here.
Great, thank you.
All right, I think we'll go with Junior's question.
Oh yeah, thank you. So great talk, Emma. Thank you for inviting me here. And actually, I see a lot of exciting recent progress from your group, and this is really amazing to me. And actually, I see a trend that it's glad to hear so much about discussion about like the data and how to combine data with physics. And I see also your recent work about, let's say, phase field and also pattern formation. Yeah, and exactly, actually, our group is also working on that, and we are mostly like implementing physics, but not much data implemented yet. So I want to follow up your discussion about like the data and physics. And actually, this is our paper time, so I want to paste it here for your information. And for a specific question for you, actually, I was thinking about you briefly mentioned like the uncertainty control quantification. And I know there is like lots of like discussions and the funding opportunities as well, right, on this important topic. Can you provide more details about what is your vision and how you plan to do that? Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we have a project that we're working on now, thinking about basically developing machine learning methods where uncertainty quantification or effective uncertainty quantification is kind of baked in from the start. And then this is something that we're working on in collaboration with a bunch of different people. And our group's responsibility is to think about kind of benchmark data sets and benchmark data sets that can be used kind of to make this feasible. And so what we're thinking about now is extending our phase field fracture data set to look at basically different boundary conditions, different material properties, and then thinking about that as a way to sort of have benchmark problems where like the way uncertainty is kind of thought of and defined and implemented is sort of defined alongside the data set as part of the challenge, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's something that we're really only starting to work on kind of this month. So it's definitely something that I'll have a better answer to in the future. But yeah, I think at least just in my opinion, I think like you said, that's kind of the next direction of this work. Another thing that I'm getting really excited about too is that there are a lot of people who do experimental work in mechanics who have been sort of sharing their data sets and also really expressed interest in sharing their data sets, and I think probably will in the future. And I think that having kind of more experimental data that's available to the broader community will sort of make problems with developing models that account for uncertainty kind of more accessible and inherent. I know also that there's been a lot of initiatives from the national labs in this direction. Like I think the Sandia Fracture Challenge is definitely an area where having some notion of uncertainty in your computational model is definitely necessary. But yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I think the next person for asking a question, yeah, Jimmy Xia, if you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Adrian. Emma, very interesting talk. And certainly, this is something quite new to me. and I'm learning a lot of interesting things. The question I have is somewhat related to some data asked history dependence of certain behavior. And the system that I'm interested in is slightly different. Biological system, cells. Actually, if you look at the 20, 30 years ago, the biologists who are studying biological phenomena were basically interested either in whole animals or intracellular systems like signaling pathways, molecular effect, and those type of things. Relatively few of them were working on collective behavior of cells. Only recently that people realized that this is an important area. So we did some work on wound healing, published in PNAS this year. And what we did was we have a 2D substrate. We can pattern the substrate, pattern fibronectin on the substrate to generate artificial wounds. Then we see MDCK cells on this and see what happened. And what we found was we have two patterns. One is the straight, linear type of forms. The other one is the wavy type of forms. It turns out that the wavy type of forms heals significantly faster, maybe 5 times faster or even 10 times faster. And we're trying to figure out why this is the case. And what we found was a number of things that are contributing to this phenomena. One, certainly this is a somewhat of chaotic system, right? The cells would move collectively based on the constraint that they feel. And it's also history dependent in the sense that once a particular location, the wound healing occurs, it actually would only progress from that point on. So if you have certain wound healing behavior to begin with, then the outcome would depend on this initiation of the phenomena. The second thing, which was also interesting, is depending on the geometrical shape, the collective motion of these cells would be very different. For example, for the linear wound, the cells tend to move parallel to the edges. But for the wavy wounds, they form vortices. They have all kinds of interesting, we have PIV images of those. They have all kinds of interesting migration patterns. Now, the question for you, so we're trying to understand this thing. The question for you is, for such a complex phenomena, what kind of data should we collect in order to really, help us understand what's going on behind these phenomena?
That's a big question. Yeah, I mean, I think that, so the wound healing system that my collaborators have developed is fairly different from that, which is what I've spent most of my time thinking about. And there's basically because the wound isn't, because the tissue is suspended above a substrate and it's kind of this more like 3D system, it doesn't necessarily have the chaotic behavior that you're describing, kind of with individual cells moving as such. It also has a lot of extracellular matrix. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about sort of the interplay between cells and extracellular matrix in these systems. But I think if you are interested, it would be really interesting to think about, like, would publishing this data set enable people who maybe don't have access to those experiments, but have some ideas, to build sort of their own model and see if sort of the collective knowledge could move forward from that, if that makes sense. I guess my answer is I don't know, but have you tried sort of crowdsourcing your research?
Good idea. Good idea. We will do that. Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks for your question.
All right. Teng,
Yeah,
can
thanks,
ask your
Adrian.
question.
Emma, wonderful talk. Really enjoy. As Zheng Jia mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, we relaunched the EML webinar this time in this season and named as EML Webinar Young Researchers Forum. And the first 4 webinars will be featuring the EML Young Investigator awardees in the past 2 years, and Emma is one of them. Last winter at the MRS meeting, I had the honor to present the award to 3 of our 4 awardees. Emma is one of them as well. That's after a couple of years of pause due to COVID. And at the MRS meeting, I learned from Emma that she started her independent PI position at the beginning of COVID, right? January 2020, I remember it told me. And she decided to publish her very first independent paper in EML. That was a single authored paper, and thanks for your trust. And I just checked that paper is well cited, and it has been cited 40 times so far since 2020. And of course, she continues publishing EML, and her 2022 EML paper, which led to the EML Young Investigator Award to her, has also been well cited. I just checked that it's been cited 21 times since last May or so. Yeah. So thank you for your trust for publishing your good paper in EML, and I guess one of the motivation we want to highlight our EML young investigators is to motivate people in the audience, especially the young researchers. Publish your best research in EML. We'll make sure at our end, we'll make sure it will be a good home for your best research. Manuel, you previously asked about Emma, the motivation of promote the public science. I can add 2 cents here. In Emma's talk, she alluded to a iMechanica Journal Club post she hosted the last May 2022. And I just checked that one, and it showed that that post by now, it has been read nearly 30,000 times. It's actually one of the most discussed and most successful iMechanica discussion post in last year. So thank you, Emma, for hosting that wonderful discussion post. And in that post, she shared her vision on the machine learning in mechanics, and provided a lot of information. For example, as also one of the might be the home place where you can find the important data information about machine learning in mechanics. So I know, Emma, you are hosting your many information about this topic in GitHub as well, right? You're updating that as well. I do see you have been updating the your iMechanica Journal Club post as well, even after that month, because we really have people reading that post along with your GitHub links as well. So this is really the long tail effect that more and more people will get back to this. I thank you very much for your contribution to the iMechanica community for that wonderful and successful discussion post. I would suggest you keep updating that to leverage the platform of iMechanica as a way to promote this specific topic. GitHub, we all know that's a very popular place to archive the data over there. But for mechanics community, I believe the interest in machine learning enabled research is surging, but there are many people may not be very aware of like GitHub and machine learning and all this. But we have tens of thousands registered users of iMechanica. So that could be a good home for you to update that information there. So promote this rising topic, and in the long run, I think it's beneficial to the community and also beneficial for your research as well. So Manuel, that's my 2 cents. That what's the benefit of promoting public science in different venues? Thank you, Emma.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your kind words, and definitely this webinar is an example of public science, and then also the iMechanica community. It's so inspiring. It's really incredible to see really senior researchers just posting their lecture notes for anyone in the world to access, or people sort of weighing in on topics that are controversial in a way that maybe you wouldn't get to see in a publication, or without going to a conference and sitting in the room and hearing people discuss things. And throughout COVID, but then also big picture, right? It's an international research community. It really does so much for all of us, especially young researchers, to have access to that. So I really appreciate all the work you do in maintaining it and making that happen. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. Definitely a shout out to iMechanica and EML. Our next question will be from Mingchao Liu. So if you can unmute yourself, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Emma, thanks for your wonderful talk. Actually, I don't have too much knowledge about machine learning, so I tried to learn a lot from your talk. So as you mentioned, that the data set is the most important, or maybe not most, but it's a very important part of the machine learning in different subjects. So my silly question is that from mechanics point of view, is there any efficient way to generate large-scale data sets? As far as I know, maybe we can use some kind of numeric simulation, for example, FEM or other method to generate data set. But it seems that it's not efficient enough. So is there any systematic way or more efficient way to generate large-scale data set?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think on the computational side, within the computational mechanics research community, there's been a ton of effort into creating large data sets and using those to train machine learning models. But running a bunch of simulations is kind of one thing. Trying to access that scale in the experimental setting is a whole other challenge. And I think, up until now, it's been relatively uncommon to see truly large mechanics data sets with experimental data. But one thing that's kind of exciting is that's actually changing. There's a bunch of people who are doing research, and this is super exciting to me, that's essentially at the interface of mechanics and robotics, more or less, where they've come up with autonomous systems to basically do very, very high throughput testing of different sort of mechanical systems. I have a colleague here at BU who his background is more in the materials, but recently he's gotten really into this concept of sort of the self-driving lab. And his name is Keith Brown. And what he's done is he's actually developed a platform where essentially different structures get 3D printed, picked up with a robotic arm, brought over to an instron, and then crushed while being video recorded, and then also recording the force displacement data. And one thing that's really exciting is that he is starting to share, or has already shared, a lot of the data that has resulted from these experiments. And he's also pretty committed to doing so moving forward. It's just a matter of kind of logistics and figuring all of that out. So I think that your question is very, very timely, in that I think it's something that historically hasn't been feasible, but moving forward is becoming more and more possible. I've also had some conversations with people at national labs who are thinking about this. I've also seen some, I can't remember the exact citation, but I've seen some papers come out where people have done very sort of clever things to make experiments high throughput. There was a paper, I can't remember if it was an EML paper or not, but where they basically had a bunch of strips and rigged them up so they could test them in parallel and get a ton of data that way. Yeah, I think it's an ongoing challenge that people are really kind of getting serious about working on now, which is really exciting. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah. It's very informative. So yeah, I think this is a general challenge. So a lot of people can work in this area. Thanks for your answer.
Yeah, and definitely, you know, when I talk to especially my experimental collaborators in tissue engineering, and I'm sure this comes up in Jimmy's work too, each individual experiment is expensive. It costs, you know, it costs money to afford the reagents and the cells and the time of setting up all of those individual experiments. And I think that something that is really exciting about sort of curating and sharing the data from these experiments is that you kind of get more for your money, or more impact per dollar, if other people can take advantage of that. And I think that, you know, every time I talk to the grad students who are actually doing those experiments, they're basically like, yeah, it would be awesome if these could be useful to more people. So I think that's something that is definitely part of the conversation as well.
Maybe I can jump in over here. Mingtao and I were collaborating on this little project about jumping robotics, and we're thinking of, you know, doing a bunch of simulation that would allow us to predict where the robotics would go to, the robots would go to. But the question is, you know, what type of simulations we can carry out that would allow us to have a predictive power and to have a reasonable data set that we can use. How to generate that efficiently? I think this is perhaps part of why Mingtao was asking this question.
Yeah,
it's a challenge. I understand your answer, but we're facing that challenge now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I know that, like, you know, with my group runs all of our simulations in Phoenix, which is an open source finite element analysis software. I know that there's been some recent work in trying to integrate Phoenix with SOFA, which is like a soft robotics simulation platform that's also open source. And I think one benefit of using these open source softwares is that there's no limitation on the number of cores you can run them on. It's not like a commercial software. You might have a limited number of tokens or something like that. So what my group does is we just write bash scripts and maybe Python wrap or something like that, and then just run tons of Phoenix simulations. We've never used SOFA before, but I think that there's been a lot of work in kind of real-time simulation in the soft robotics research community that draws from FEA or is based on FEA in some cases that might be useful for that, but I don't know.
Good discussion. Yes, Cheng, yeah, I think we can go with you.
Yeah, Emma, thanks for the wonderful talk. My question is actually very similar to Mingchao's question. So you talked about curating data, a data set. So simulations or experiments, and sometimes the simulations and experiments just yield I mean, very wrong results or results with maybe large error. So my question is, for a researcher like you who generates data, so how do you generate a good data set containing sufficient data of high accuracy? And for a researcher like me who use open source data, so how can I determine whether a data set is a good data set or not? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a really, in some ways, it's kind of a very deep question, I think. I think that, what my group does on an individual level is that we really just spend a lot of time trying to be careful. If we know that we're going to be publishing our code and publishing the data and sort of allowing others to really, take a lens to the work that we're doing, it really motivates us to try to be careful and do things slowly and carefully along the way. I think I said this earlier, but then also the peer review process, I think, helps with that a little bit, in that a lot of the times, or almost all the time, our data sets we're publishing them alongside publications. So we encourage reviewers to look at the data and code as well, if they have the resources to. But I think that one thing that is sort of a broader conversation within the research community, even outside mechanics, is kind of this idea that maybe there should be more consideration of non-publication research products, and maybe more opportunities for peer reviewing data, or being able to sort of do more kind of like quality control on open access data sets. And I think that that's something that it is kind of this kind of bigger, broader question that I would be happy to talk about with anyone, but I don't have any answers for. I know there's a lot of people who are, really dedicating their careers to thinking about these things, and I think it's very exciting. And I also think that there's all these different governmental funding agencies around the world. And a lot of them are putting open science aspects into their funding mandates. And I think that because a lot of that has been happening over kind of the past 5 years to 10 years, and will sort of continue to change over the next 5 to 10 years, it's an area where the conversation is going to change a lot. And I'm kind of excited to see sort of what happens and how things can become more streamlined and more useful. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
It's another, I don't really know.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will say for the website that I maintain, just the casual GitHub website, it's just people who I've seen present at conferences or people who've reached out to me, and the sort of the quality of that data is tied to the reputation of the researchers who published it, and I don't do anything more sophisticated than that. And I think that there's definitely an opportunity to think about what it actually means to sort of publish a data set and how a data set should be peer reviewed. And I think that that's a conversation that I look forward to seeing unfold.
Thank you, Emma. Any of the panelists have follow-up question? Yes.
Hi, I had a question that's a more specific one. Maybe it could be generalized. When you were talking about the data set, it was one slide about the sarcomeres, I think they were called, and how you get images, and then you have a high throughput process to do image segmentation and gather other metrics. Can you elaborate more? What kind of metrics have you done? I was looking into something similar, but for soil mechanics, and I was wondering, is this metrics using software like Fiji, ImageJ, or AI? What what I'm saying is, what kind of metrics are you interested in image datasets as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that with regard to our collaborations in tissue engineering, we sort of so the reason why they're interested in working with us is because our software can automate things that they do by hand, or maybe make getting relatively simple metrics or information available in a more straightforward way. So to date, most of what we've done is pretty simple, in that things that we pull out of these data are things like sarcomere length, or maybe myofibril chain length, things like that, things that are sort of quite kind of simple in first order. But what we're hoping to build towards, which we haven't done yet, this is sort of an aspirational project, is we're hoping to really start looking at creating kind of statistical models of these cells and thinking of them really as graph structures, and trying to sort of look a lot at sort of temporal and spatial synchrony or lack of synchrony or correlations. And we just haven't really done anything complicated yet, if I'm being honest. But we're definitely hoping to in the future.
Yeah, I was wondering, the exact level of how deep you are into this game. It's just something that's more like hard-coded, or if it's something data-driven as well, because I think there is like another field of post-processing data sets and extracting information with data-driven techniques like embedding, segmentation, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically, with all of our image analysis pipelines, they are sort of they are very sort of like modular in the sense that we have sort of like a segmentation approach, a tracking approach, and an analysis approach, and each one can be swapped out for something else. And sometimes we actually end up doing that as we need to create sort of improvements. We also have some machine learning sort of throughout these pipelines, but it's really simple stuff. Like we're basically using machine learning for maybe like we'll use Gaussian processes, for example, just for interpolation, like just to interpolate a time series, something like that. But yeah, we're always interested in trying to see if different sort of machine learning approaches and say, for example, segmentation that are quite popular are able to outperform our procedural algorithms. And so far we haven't been so far procedural algorithms are doing better, but I wouldn't be surprised if that changes soon, and we definitely have to be ready to adapt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that was another question. I'm looking at a high throughput, framework, one to massively generate data and collect data. But the question is, how do you verify each sample like separately? And I think one way we were thinking in this framework was to have like a grad student actually looking at randomly sample a few samples and see if, for example, our algorithm is actually detecting the structures we're looking to detect. So I'm not sure what's a proper way to validate like thousands of data samples. I don't know if you have any comment on that as well.
Yeah, this is definitely something I talk about with my students and something that's ongoing. One of my students has been looking at Napari, which is it's basically like it's a package in Python that's kind of like ImageJ, but it can allow you. It's Python based, and it can allow you to sort of do some of that like pointing and clicking a little bit more efficiently. So that's one thing that might be worth looking into. I think another one of my students also figured out a way to do some segmentation on an iPad, which just makes things a little bit like a little more ergonomic, kind of being able to like color things in and circle them. But yeah, it's one of those things where definitely there are some like pretty sort of tedious things that happen along the way in validating your image analysis pipelines. I think in general for us, it takes longer to validate a pipeline than it does to create the pipeline itself. And I think that's something that my students would definitely attest to. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I guess you can crowdsource a little bit of that as well. Not just one grad student, but maybe multiple grad students do.
Yeah, well, we were working. True. We were working with David Nordsleden at the University of Michigan, and he actually helped us with some of the validation of our pipeline on their data. And he had his PhD student and then the undergraduate student that she was mentoring. He had them basically do some manual tracking, which I don't know if anyone's ever done it, but manual tracking is a nightmare because you have to go between all of the frames. And one thing that we were very satisfied with on our end is, first of all, that they were willing to do that on our behalf. That was very much appreciated. But then also the difference between the individuals was actually greater than the difference between the individual results and our pipeline. So our pipeline predicted kind of the mean of two individuals. So we're happy with that. But then, I don't know, I felt really bad that they were doing manual tracking also.
Yeah, I mean, that seems difficult to avoid though, no? For validation, is there a way to avoid that?
It's a good question. We try to do a lot with synthetic data and trying to generate really realistic synthetic data. So for example, like running finite element simulations, but then projecting like the real experimental textures on those finite element simulations to make synthetic data. But I think to your point, like in some cases, you really need at least a few examples of manual tracking because synthetic data is almost always, you can't capture everything.
Yeah, I think it also goes to what Chengjia was saying, that sometimes the simulation and the experiment don't agree, and then how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, definitely.
Any other questions? Yeah, I think Chengjia was muted. Yes.
Adrian, I want to make a very short announcement before the end of today's webinar. So if there is no more question from the audience, maybe I can share my slides. Can you see my slides now?
It's loading.
No.
There we go. Yeah,
Yes.
Now we can see.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So here are the flyers for the first two EML webinars, the Young Research Forum. And today, Emma gives a wonderful talk. And the first webinar was given by Professor Robin Bai from Northeastern University. And the announcement I want to make is the next webinar will be given by Professor Diego Maceroni from University of Trento in Italy. He will give the webinar in late November, but the exact date will be announced later. So here's the announcement I want to make. Please stay tuned. Okay. Let me unshare my slides. Adrian, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we have answered all questions, unless anybody has a last-minute question. Otherwise, we can thank Emma once again for that wonderful talk, and then for answering all of our questions. I think that's great. Great talk, and then great discussion afterwards. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank
you, Adrian.
Thank you all so much for doing this. It's been really great to chat with you all. And yeah, thanks again to Adrian for hosting, and the organizers for making this happen. I mean, it's a lot of fun to get to share our work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Keep
you.
the good work, Emma.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.